Frank Sinatra thought rock and roll was degenerate noise. But on March 26, 1960, a freshly discharged Elvis walked into the Fontainebleau's Grand Ballroom in a tux and made Frank sing Love Me Tender while he crooned Witchcraft. Live TV froze. Two worlds collided. What happened next rewired Hollywood's idea of cool. March 26, 1960. Miami Beach shimmered like chrome under the hotel's floodlights. Inside the Fontainebleau's Grand Ballroom, 2,000 people pressed shoulder to shoulder, perfume and cigar smoke mixing with the buzz of television cables. The stage glittered beneath chandeliers. The air smelled of polish and heat. For one night, America's split generation shared the same oxygen. Director Richard Dunlap stood by the camera platform, counting down in a whisper only the crew could hear. Stand by 5, 4. On stage, Elvis Presley straightened his cuff. The tux fit too tight, sleeves crisp, hair slicked back with army discipline. In the wings, Frank Sinatra adjusted his bow tie like he'd done 1,000 nights before. Their eyes met for a second, just long enough to feel the weight of expectation. Nancy Sinatra peeked from behind the curtain, cue card in hand, heart hammering. The band tested a slow brass swell. A single mic hung center stage, polished to a mirror. This metal caught the spotlight and glowed like a challenge. 3 years had passed since Elvis last faced a camera. Now he was 25, back from uniform to spotlight. Every gesture watched by a country wondering if the boy who shook the world could still move it. Outside the hall, fans pressed against the glass, screaming names the security guards pretended not to hear. Inside, Rat Pack regulars sat beside teenagers in polka-dot dresses. 2 tribes, 1 room. Timex logos flashed on cue cards. ABC's technicians whispered about coast-to-coast signals, about how many homes the live feed might reach. The estimate floated somewhere near 60 million. Someone joked that half of America would be breathing in black and white that night. Colonel Tom Parker leaned close to Elvis. "Remember, son," he murmured. "They came to see a man, not a kid." Elvis smiled, but his fingers twitched. Beneath the tux, he could still feel the coarse fabric of army fatigues. Fame had paused, not vanished. Would they still scream, or would they stare? The stage manager's voice sliced through the tension. "Places!" Frank stepped toward his mark, smooth as silk. Elvis followed, his shoes echoing against marble. The crowd hushed. The lights dimmed to a silver glow. The first camera's red tally light blinked on. For a heartbeat, nobody breathed. Somewhere, a flashbulb cracked. The sound bounced off the ballroom walls like static. Elvis inhaled. The air tasted of nerves and nostalgia. Across from him, Frank tilted his head, a small smirk tugging at his lip, as if daring the kid to prove that noise could be music after all. Millions were watching, though none could guess what was about to happen when tradition and rebellion shared a microphone. Would you have bet on the crooner or the king? 3 years before that Miami night, a single sentence lit a cultural fuse. In 1957, Frank Sinatra called rock and roll the most brutal, ugly, degenerate, vicious form of expression. Newspapers printed it coast to coast. Parents clipped it out and pinned it to refrigerators. For them, it wasn't just Frank's opinion. It was proof that decency still had a defender. But somewhere in Germany, a young soldier named Elvis Presley read those words and went quiet. He was halfway through his service, uniform pressed, hair cropped. Reporters asked what he thought about Sinatra's attack. Elvis only smiled and said softly, "I admire him. No anger, no insult, just grace." Still, the quote hung in the air like smoke. Now that smoke filled the Fontainebleau ballroom. Sinatra's orchestra tuned to perfection. Elvis's band waited with southern patience. The two styles had never shared the same air. One belonged to tuxedos and champagne, the other to jukeboxes and milkshakes. Yet, tonight, television would force them to share a frame. Behind the curtain, Frank Sinatra leaned over and whispered, "You sure about this, boss?" Sinatra didn't answer. He just adjusted his cufflinks, the same silver pair he wore opening night at the Sands. Elvis caught the gesture from across the stage and nodded once. Respectful. America didn't know it yet, but this wasn't just a duet. It was a handshake across a generational war. Colonel Parker watched from the shadows, puffing on a cigar. The tension wasn't just artistic, it was financial, reputational, and personal. If the performance flopped, both names could bleed in headlines. If it soared, television itself might change shape. Frank cleared his throat. "How's the kid?" he muttered. "Steady as a metronome," Parker said. A hush fell. The floor manager raised a hand. Seconds later, cameras rolled again. Sinatra walked out first, every movement polished. Elvis followed, measured but alive, like a match about to strike. No one spoke it aloud, but the audience knew this was bigger than music. It was a test of tone, taste, and time. Would swing survive the storm? Would rock grow up enough to share the stage? Nancy Sinatra stood sidestage, eyes wide. She'd grown up hearing her father's voice echo through casinos. Now she watched the man she idolized stand beside the boy who scared America's parents. She whispered to no one, "Please let it work." Colonel Parker leaned toward Elvis one last time. His voice was calm but sharp. "Let 'em see you smile, son." The spotlight widened. The crowd inhaled. History exhaled. Colonel Tom Parker paced the narrow corridor behind the ballroom, stopwatch in one hand, cigar in the other. His deal with ABC was legendary. $125,000 for 2 songs. A figure that made network executives gasp and Frank Sinatra raise an eyebrow. It wasn't greed. It was strategy. Parker knew that every second on air could reset Elvis Presley's destiny. Inside the Fontainebleau, the tension felt electric. The stage lights hummed. Crew members whispered through headsets. Timex logos glowed on cue cards like corporate prayers. Somewhere in New York, advertisers held their breath, because this wasn't just a performance. It was a test. Could Elvis survive America's return to formality after the wildness he started? Backstage, Elvis leaned against a piano bench. The tuxedo clung to him like borrowed confidence. He looked at his reflection in a metal riser. The same face that once smiled from posters, now slightly older, sharper, quieter. "All this for 2 songs, he muttered. His drummer chuckled. 2 songs that might save television. At the front of the hall, Sinatra's musicians filled the air with horns smooth as velvet. Frank, ever the perfectionist, adjusted the set list with a fountain pen. "No surprises," he told the bandleader. "Clean, classy, nothing cheap." But the surprises were already in motion. ABC's floor manager whispered, "Cue card 3, duet." He underlined it twice. Parker's eyes flashed. "That's our bridge," he said quietly. "That's where we make history." The ballroom buzzed. 2,000 people waited, unaware they were part of a national experiment. Some clutched hand fans printed with Sinatra's face. Others held folded photos of Elvis in uniform. The noise rose, a strange blend of old applause and new screams. The cameras reset. One technician, nervous, wiped sweat from the lens. Another tested the mic, which gave a low hum that rolled through the room like distant thunder. The countdown began again. 5. The crowd leaned forward. 4. Sinatra's band paused mid-scale. 3. Elvis smoothed his hair with a handkerchief. 2.
Parker whispered, "Smile, son."
1. The curtain parted. Frank stood center stage, poised, half grin, half challenge. Elvis entered from the opposite side, each step measured, each breath heavier than the last. The tuxedo gleamed under the heat of the lights. For a moment, both men stood motionless, 2 different Americas facing each other. The brass section hit a low note. The announcer's voice cracked through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, the moment you've been waiting for." Applause exploded, swallowing the room. Sinatra nodded once toward Elvis, his smirk softening. Elvis nodded back. In that instant, competition turned to ceremony. The past was greeting the future. Frank lifted the mic. "Shall we?" he asked. Elvis smiled. "Let's give them something to talk about." The cue card flipped. One word shone in bold ink: duet. Would they clash or connect? America held its breath to find out. The ballroom lights dimmed to a warm amber. A hush swept through the room, so complete that the sound of a single camera reel spinning could be heard. The announcer's voice faded, replaced by the soft, confident tone of Frank Sinatra. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we thought we'd do something unexpected." He glanced at Elvis, and for a beat, neither man spoke. Two styles, two worlds, and now one stage. Then it began. The orchestra struck the opening bars of Witchcraft. But instead of Sinatra's silk baritone, the first voice belonged to Elvis Presley. Low, playful, half smooth, half rebel. His southern drawl slid across the lyrics like sunlight on bourbon. The crowd blinked, confused, then erupted in applause. Frank's eyebrows lifted in surprise. The kid wasn't mocking the song. He was owning it. A grin broke across Sinatra's face, genuine, maybe even proud. Elvis moved across the stage with that familiar sway, but slower now, deliberate. Every movement said, "I can meet you on your turf and still sound like me." When the song ended, the applause hit like a wave. Sinatra raised a hand for quiet, smiling. "Now, if you'll allow me," the orchestra switched keys. And suddenly, the opening notes of "Love Me Tender" filled the air. Frank began to sing. The crowd went still again, completely still. His voice, usually quicksilver cool, now sounded fragile, intimate. The crooner of Vegas was whispering a lullaby written for teenagers. And it worked. Every note landed soft, sincere. Elvis watched him from a few steps away, nodding to the rhythm, almost like a student watching a master. Not in technique, but in courage. The television crew forgot to breathe. The sound engineer's hand trembled on the fader. Somewhere, a Timex executive whispered, "This is gold." Frank hit the final line, "And I always will," and let the silence hang. Then, for the first time that night, he looked straight at Elvis. Elvis stepped forward. Together, they shared a single microphone. Frank chuckled. "Never thought I'd sing that one." Elvis grinned. "Never thought I'd let ya." The room broke into laughter and cheers. The two men shook hands, slow and deliberate, under 1,000 flashing bulbs. It wasn't planned. It wasn't rehearsed. It was respect, broadcast live. Somewhere in that moment, the crowd stopped choosing sides.
Radpack-Fans klebt besiede Teenagers in leather jackets.
Even the security guards smiled. Sinatra leaned close, still gripping Elvis's hand. "You did all right, kid," he murmured. Elvis winked. "You too, sir." Applause surged. Cameras zoomed in. The handshake lingered, and in it, a nation saw something it hadn't in years. Unity. The red tally light glowed. The director whispered, "Hold on that shot." It was more than a duet. It was a bridge. And as the broadcast rolled on, America realized history had just changed tune. The applause still echoed when the orchestra faded into the next cue. Elvis stayed center stage, breath steady but heart racing. Across from him, Frank straightened his jacket, a faint smile softening the sharp angles of his face. For a moment, neither man looked like a legend, just two performers grateful to still matter. Elvis leaned into the mic. "I'd like to thank Mr. Sinatra," he said, voice steady but humble, "for inviting me back to the stage." Frank replied smoothly, "It's good to have you home, son." The crowd roared. It wasn't an introduction anymore. It was a coronation. Behind the cameras, ABC producers exchanged stunned glances. They'd expected a ratings win. What they got felt like cultural therapy. One generation forgiving another in real time. The next number rolled in. "Stuck on You," Elvis's first post-Army single. His voice carried warmth instead of rebellion. The tux didn't shrink him. It refined him. Every word sounded like proof that he could grow without losing the spark that made him famous. Nancy Sinatra, watching from the wings, wiped a tear. "He's not fighting the song anymore," she whispered. "He's sharing it." Beside her, Sammy Davis Jr. laughed softly. "That's how legends last, sweetheart. They learn to duet with time." Frank nodded toward the band, and together they closed the medley with Fame and Fortune. The horns shimmered. The rhythm swung. It wasn't rock, it wasn't swing, it was something in between, something new. When the final chord rang out, Elvis bowed low. The crowd leapt to its feet, clapping in rhythm, screaming both names, Elvis, Frank, until the room vibrated. Cameras panned across the faces. Old fans, young fans, the uncertain suddenly united. Backstage, a clipboard slammed against the console. A stagehand shouted, "Trendex ratings are off the charts." An executive scribbled the number, 41.5, in block letters. A new television record. Parker grinned like a man who'd just sold the moon. But for Elvis, it wasn't the money or the score. It was the silence between applause, the realization that acceptance had replaced controversy. He wasn't just back, he was welcomed. The crowd wouldn't sit down. Frank motioned to the cameras, gesturing to cut. Elvis shook his head slightly. "Let 'em have it," he said. And the two men, laughing, took one last bow side by side. Two voices, one breath. In that instant, competition melted into camaraderie. America had come to see a feud. Instead, it witnessed forgiveness. And above it all, the sound of applause refused to fade. When the broadcast finally aired on May 12, 1960, America stopped for an hour. At 9:30 p.m. sharp, living rooms from Maine to California glowed with the same black and white light. Housewives turned down stove burners. Teenagers hushed their parents. It was Thursday night, but it felt like an event. The opening frame read, "The Frank Sinatra Timex Show. Welcome home, Elvis." Within minutes, phones rang in ABC offices. Viewers wanted to know, was that handshake real? Was it scripted? By the time the credits rolled, the numbers told the story. A 41.5 Trendex rating. Nearly two-thirds of every television in America tuned in. No show had done that since Eisenhower's inauguration. Sponsors celebrated. Parker toasted. Sinatra poured a drink and watched the playback in silence. On screen, the tuxedos gleamed, the microphones sparkled, and the sound felt impossibly clean. The performance looked effortless, but every second was rehearsed with surgical care. The network had captured lightning in polite evening wear. Producers called it a perfect collision. Critics, who once dismissed Elvis as a sideshow, wrote that he had grown up overnight. Newspapers the next morning ran split photos of the handshake with the headline, "Youth and Elegance Share a Stage." The Fontainebleau Ballroom, just 2,200 seats, suddenly became mythic. Guests bragged for decades about being there. The hotel even framed a still photo of the duet and hung it by the lobby elevators. A small brass plate below read, March 26, 1960, when two worlds agreed. In boardrooms across Hollywood, the lesson was clear. Variety television had found a formula. Opposites attract ratings. Within a year, networks rushed to pair contrasts. Country with jazz, comedians with poets, new with old. The crossover special was born. Elvis's manager bragged that his client had brought style to rebellion. Sinatra's publicist countered that Frank had given rock legitimacy. Both were right. Neither seemed to mind. Clips of the night were replayed endlessly. Years later, fragments appeared in documentaries, scratched and grainy but still golden. A few bootleg reels surfaced. One marked rehearsal, Fontainebleau. You could hear laughter off mic, the kind that comes from genuine respect. Somewhere in a New York archive, a notepad from the control room still exists. On its final page, written in pencil, one word stands alone: crossovers. It wasn't just a note, it was prophecy. Because that single handshake didn't just rewrite a night of television. It rewired the industry's bloodstream. And everyone, from studio execs to wide-eyed fans, could feel it pulsing through the screen. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, the echo of that handshake stayed alive. It traveled through living rooms, radio shows, and dinner conversations. People didn't just talk about a performance, they talked about what it meant. In an era when America was dividing by age, sound, and style, two men had quietly refused to pick sides. Elvis and Frank never recorded another duet, but they didn't need to. One night was enough to prove that respect could outsing rivalry. In the following weeks, the press ran endless comparisons. Who sang better? Who owned the stage? Who looked more at ease? Yet buried inside every article was a single word that neither man had said aloud. Respect. Elvis returned to Hollywood, filming GI Blues under desert heat. Sinatra resumed his Vegas schedule, silk jackets and late-night martinis. They'd both gone back to their worlds, but those worlds felt smaller now, closer. When reporters later asked Sinatra if his opinion on rock and roll had changed, he smiled slightly. "I'd say the kid does all right," he said. It was a quiet surrender, and it meant more than an apology. And Elvis? He carried that moment like a medal. In later interviews, he'd grin and say, "I got to sing with the chairman of the board." Then he'd pause, eyes softening. And he didn't mind one bit. Years passed. The world changed. Hairstyles, presidents, even televisions. But somewhere inside those black and white reels, the handshake never aged. Kept replaying, two hands bridging a generation gap wider than any stage. At Graceland, there's a small photo on display, Elvis in his tux, Frank midlaugh. Fans still stop there longer than anywhere else. Some whisper, "That was the night music grew up." Others simply smile. What would you have done if you were them? Could you share your spotlight with someone who once dismissed you? Maybe that's the quiet power of legends. Not how loud they sing, but how gracefully they listen. The night of March 26, 1960 wasn't about winning. It was about yielding, showing that evolution doesn't erase the past. It honors it. And as the ballroom lights faded, the applause still hung like starlight. Proof that greatness isn't owned by one generation. It's passed, hand to hand, note to note, smile to smile. Two artists met on a stage. A nation met itself. And for once, everyone kept the beat together. The final applause faded into static, but the story didn't end there. Decades later, clips from that night still circulate online. Grainy footage of two men in tuxedos proving that opposites don't have to collide. They can connect. The mic hums, the crowd roars, and every replay feels like a heartbeat from a time when courage meant sharing the stage. If you listen closely, you can hear more than a song. You can hear a nation exhaling. For one brief hour, style, class, and age stopped fighting. Music did what words couldn't. It made people meet halfway. Somewhere in the Fontainebleau archives, a sound engineer's log sheet still exists. Next to the line duet, he scribbled one note in pencil. Worked. No flourish, no commentary. Just one word that captured a miracle. Today, that performance feels almost impossible. Imagine two stars at the top of their worlds agreeing to swap roles, risk ridicule, and trust the audience to understand. No auto-tune, no PR safety net. Just authenticity, live, unfiltered, brave. It reminds us how simple greatness can be. One voice extending to another, one ego lowered for harmony's sake. If you've ever argued about what's real music, remember that night. Frank defended tradition. Elvis embodied rebellion. And both learned that art doesn't survive by choosing sides. It survives by listening. Maybe that's the lesson hidden inside every duet. You don't lose yourself when you share the stage. You expand. Years after the show, when fans asked Sinatra about Elvis, he said, "He was a gentleman." And when Elvis's crew mentioned Frank, he'd smile. "He showed me class." Two brief sentences. Two bridges that still hold. That's why the footage matters. Because it's not just nostalgia. It's instruction. It shows how grace can outlast noise, and how humility can outshine fame. If you were there in 1960, you remember the electricity. If you weren't, you can still feel it through the flicker of that black and white reel. Every cheer, every handshake, every shared glance is proof that unity doesn't need speeches. It needs rhythm. So when you finish this story, don't let it fade like another vintage clip. Share it with someone from a different generation. Parent who loved Sinatra. A kid who loves rock. Let them see how two legends made peace in 4 minutes of television. Ask them this. If they could duet with their opposite, what song would they choose? Because the night Frank and Elvis met wasn't just history. It was homework for all of us. Bravery isn't always loud. Sometimes it sounds like harmony. If the story moved you, if it made you believe that respect still has rhythm, share it, tag someone you've debated with, and keep the song alive. The bridge they built is still standing. Now it's your turn to cross it.